Chapter 6. The Ball at Netherfield. Elizabeth repeated to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She could not believe that Mr. Darcy could be so undeserving of Mr. Bingley's friendship, but it was not in her nature to question the truthfulness of a young man of such pleasing appearance as Wickham. "They have both been mistaken, I expect," she said, "in some way or other, of which we can form no idea." The two young ladies were called from the garden, where this conversation was taking place, by the arrival of some of the persons of whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sisters came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesday. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst appeared very pleased to see their dear friend again, and complained that it was a long time since they had last met. They took very little notice of the rest of the family, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, saying not much to Elizabeth and nothing at all to the others. The thought of the Netherfield ball was exciting to every female of the family. Mrs. Bennet considered it to be given as a mark of attention to her oldest daughter, and was particularly pleased at receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself instead of by means of a formal card. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the society of her two friends and the attentions of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham. The happiness of Kitty and Lydia depended less on any special event or person. All that they wished for was plenty of partners. Even the serious-minded Mary was willing to go. Elizabeth's spirits were so high that though she did not often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation. To her surprise, he replied that he would go, and added, "I shall hope to be honoured in the dance with the hands of all my cousins in the course of the evening. And I take this opportunity of asking for yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first two dances especially. I trust that my cousin Jane would understand the reasons for this preference, and not think that it is in any way disrespectful to her." Elizabeth felt herself completely at a disadvantage. She had fully intended being promised to Wickham for those same dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead. Her liveliness had never been expressed at a worse moment, but she could do nothing. Mr. Collins' offer was accepted with as much pleasure as she could manage to show. It now first struck her, though, that she was chosen from among her sisters as being suitable in his opinion to be his wife at Husband Parsonage. The idea was soon strengthened as she observed his increasing politeness to her, and though she herself was more astonished than pleased, it was not long before her mother let her know that the possibility of the marriage was extremely pleasing to her. Elizabeth pretended not to understand her, because she knew very well that a serious argument would result from any reply. Mr. Collins might never make the offer, and until he did, it was useless to quarrel about him. If there had not been a ball to get ready for and to talk about, the younger Mrs. Bennet would have been in a sad state at this time. From the day of the invitation to the day of the ball, continuous rain prevented them from walking to Meryton. No aunt, no officers, no news could be looked for. Even Elizabeth might have found some test of her patience in weather that delayed the development of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham, and nothing less than a dance on Tuesday could have made such a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday bearable to Kitty and Lydia. On the Tuesday evening, Elizabeth entered the sitting-room at the Netherfield and looked without success for Mr. Wickham among the group of officers present there. Until then, no doubt about him coming had entered her mind. She had dressed with more care than usual and readied herself in the highest spirits to complete the winning of his heart. But in a moment the terrible thought came to her that he had been purposely left out of the Bingley's invitation to the officers for Mr. Darcy's pleasure, and although this was not exactly the case, his friend Mr. Denny told them that Wickham had had to go to London on business, and added, "I do not imagine that he would have gone just now if he had not wished to avoid a certain gentleman here." This information sharpened Elizabeth's feelings of displeasure against Mr. Darcy, and although she tried to be cheerful, the first two dances brought a return of unhappiness. Mr. Collins, serious and awkward, apologizing instead of paying attention, and often moving wrongly without being conscious of it, brought her all the shame and unhappiness which a disagreeable partner can give. She danced next with an officer. Then she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his request for her hand that, without knowing what she did, she accepted him. Elizabeth took her place in the set, astonished at the honor at which she had arrived in being allowed to stand opposite to Mr. Darcy, and seeing in the faces of her neighbors their equal astonishment. They spoke very little until they had finished the dance, when he asked her if she and her sisters did not often walk to Meryton. She answered that this was so, and, unable to stop herself, added, "When we met you the other day there, we had just been forming a new acquaintance." The effect was immediate. The expression on his face became prouder than ever. At last he spoke. "Mr. Wickham is fortunate enough to have such pleasing manners that he can always be sure of making friends. It is less certain that he is able to keep them." "He has been unlucky enough to lose your friendship," replied Elizabeth. Darcy made no answer, and seemed anxious to change the subject. At that moment Sir William Lucas appeared, and stopped to offer him a mark of attention. "My dear sir, such very high-class dancing is not often seen. I must hope to have this pleasure often repeated, especially after a certain desirable event," and he looked towards Jane and Mr. Bingley. "What congratulations will then flow in?" Sir William's mention of his friend seemed to strike Darcy with some force, and his eyes were directed with a very serious expression towards Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. When the dance was over, Miss Bingley came towards Elizabeth and, with a look of scorn, addressed her as follows: "So, Miss Eliza, I hear you are quite pleased with George Wickham, but let me warn you not to trust what he says. The story that Mr. Darcy has wronged him is completely untrue. He has always been kind to him, though Wickham treated him in a shameful manner. I do not know the details, but I do know that Mr. Darcy is not to blame. I pity you, Miss Eliza, but really, considering his family, one could not expect much better." "His guilt and his family appear, by your account, to be the same," said Elizabeth angrily. I beg your pardon," replied Miss Bingley, turning away. "My words were kindly meant." Elizabeth then went in search of her oldest sister, who met her with a smile of such sweet satisfaction that Elizabeth immediately understood her feelings and forgot everything else for the moment in the hope that Jane was on the way to happiness. Jane began to talk about Mr. Wickham. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of the history, but is sure that his friend has acted rightly and honourably. I am sorry to say that by his account, Mr. Wickham is not at all a respectable young man. Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself? No, he never saw him until the other morning at Meryton. This explanation, then, is what he has received from Mr. Darcy. I am perfectly satisfied. Mr. Bingley has defended his friend, but I shall continue to hold the same opinion.
She then changed the subject to one more pleasing to them both, and listened with pleasure to the happy hopes which Jane had of Mr. Bingley's feelings towards her. When Mr. Bingley himself joined them, Elizabeth moved away to Miss Lucas. Shortly afterwards, Mr. Collins came up to them in a state of great excitement. He had discovered that Mr. Darcy was a relative of Lady Catherine. "You are not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy?" "Of course I am." Elizabeth tried hard to persuade him against this, warning him that Mr. Darcy would consider it a piece of impoliteness rather than as a mark of respect for his aunt. "Pardon me for neglecting to take advantage of your advice," was his reply. "But in the case before us, I consider myself more fitted by education and study to decide on what is right than a young lady like yourself." And with that, he left her to approach Mr. Darcy, whose astonishment was plain, and who replied with cold politeness. Elizabeth felt ashamed of her cousin, and turned her attention to the more pleasing subject of Jane's future. Her mother's thoughts were plainly of the same kind, and when they sat down to supper, Elizabeth was deeply annoyed to find that Mrs. Bennet was talking loudly to Lady Lucas of nothing else but her expectations that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth tried without success to control her mother's words, because she could see that they were heard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite them. Nothing she could say had any effect. Elizabeth reddened with shame. When supper was over, singing was mentioned, and Elizabeth had the added discomfort of seeing Mary getting ready to entertain the company. Mary was the least pretty of the 5 sisters, so she had tried to make herself more attractive by becoming more able than the others, and was always eager to bring her musical skill to notice. But her powers were by no means fitted for this kind of performance. Her voice was weak and her manner unnatural. Elizabeth listened with impatience. Mary sang twice, and Elizabeth could see Mr. Bingley's sisters exchanging scornful smiles. She looked at her father, who understood and gently stopped his daughter. The rest of the evening brought Elizabeth a little amusement. Mr. Collins continued at her side and would not leave her alone. Mr. Darcy took no more notice of her, even when he was standing near her. But Mrs. Bennet left Netherfield perfectly satisfied. She was fully confident that she would see Jane married in the course of 3 or 4 months. She thought with equal certainty of having another daughter married to Mr. Collins. She loved Elizabeth less than her other daughters, and she thought Mr. Collins quite good enough for her.